I'd like to welcome you to the Autism Society of South Central Wisconsin Safety Series. Today, we're going to be talking about safety and interacting with law enforcement and doing some background for this call because this is one of the topics that people asked us to look over. Discovered a cool little program going on in McFarland, Wisconsin, which I live down in Stoughton, so it's right in my backyard. So I reached out and got in touch with Officer John Miller, and excited that he is able to join us tonight to talk about his years of experience of working with people on the autism spectrum as well as other special healthcare needs. So really excited to have Officer Miller here tonight. Would ask that, I don't know, John, if you want to ask questions during the middle or if you just want to wait for the end, if they should raise their hands. I'll be watching the chat, and if I feel something's really important, I can interrupt that. Um, but do you just want to get going and see how it goes?
Yeah, I'm good with taking questions as they come.
Okay.
It may be pertinent to what the topic is that I'm addressing at the time, so that works just fine for me.
All right. So I will also then watch for people to unmute. Unmute will show me that you might have a question. So if you accidentally unmute, Nancy, do you have a question? Nope, she just muted again. See how good I am? I am really good. So just feel free, if you do have a question, just unmute or put it in the chat and we will get to it. So thank you all very much for being here. John, go ahead.
Well, thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this, and this is pretty cool. I'm thankful for the opportunity to be here and speak. So just real quick, a little bit about me. I've been a police officer in McFarland since 2001, October. So it's been quite a while since I've been in law enforcement. And I had the opportunity to become our school resource officer in McFarland almost 10 years ago. So I've been in the schools now for 10 years. It's hard to count this year as being in the schools, but I'm still there. We're still doing stuff. Prior to being the school resource officer, I worked patrol, and I had not had a lot of experience in interacting with students with special needs or autism. And as I got into my job and I learned that there was a whole other world that I wasn't familiar with. I attended a number of trainings that the school offered that were offered through different law enforcement training classes, and interacted with parents and staff, the guidance counselor, the guidance counselor staffs at the school, and just really tried to learn as much as possible, because it's a pretty important topic. And being in law enforcement and interacting with people with special needs, it can be pretty intimidating, and it can be intimidating on both sides, especially on our law enforcement side if we don't know what to do, and for the person that we're interacting with if they're not sure what to expect. And I work real hard with my staff at the McFarland Police Department to train them on how to interact, the best practices, things to not do, which is real important, and just generally how to be the best officer that they can at that time. So for me, as I progressed through my first year or so as a school resource officer, I learned that there were a lot of things that I wasn't familiar with. And we had special needs students that would elope from the school. They would have some self-injurious behavior. They would have outbursts that I wasn't sure how to interact with that stuff. And again, I tried to learn as much as I could. And as I did, I began to enjoy a lot of those interactions with our special needs students, because we got to get to know all of them. We'd go on field trips together. I get invited to classrooms, do activities, and it really became the highlight of my day as I progressed through this. And it was during that time that I also learned that there were a number of our students and parents had had some negative interactions with law enforcement. And that really opened my eyes that we needed to do a better job on our end. During this time, there was a school in McFarland, Common Threads, that opened up. It was a special needs school. And I also got to know that staff. And especially at that school, there were students who had some very negative interactions with law enforcement. So it became my goal to try to change that perception and help them that when they do need law enforcement, that they would not be afraid to come to us. And I've got a short story where that really pays off later with some of that. So as my story goes on, I got to know our special needs students at the McFarland in the McFarland School District. But what I found out later is that I was kind of the only one that knew our kids in the department, because our patrol staff just really didn't have to interact with students in general. It was me doing it. Well, we had one of my first two stories here. We had a younger student had eloped from one of our schools, and the school wasn't aware that the student had left, and they had walked to another school in our district. And the student comes in, and the staff had no idea who the student was. They weren't able to communicate who they were. But this was a student that I had built a relationship with, and I knew. Well, they called me over, and as soon as I see the student, I recognize them. They recognize me, and I have the phone number for the parents, I'm able to call the school, I collect the student, and we bring them back. And this was a student who previously was terrified of law enforcement, but I had built that relationship with the student that when they saw me, they weren't afraid. And that was an eye opener for me. Kind of the second big experience that I had was we had a student who lived in Madison who attended our school district. And it was in the middle of the night, and they had eloped from their house. And the parent was they were not aware that their child had left. And it was not a winter night, but it was a cold fall night. And the student had walked several blocks away and began knocking on doors, and actually walked into a house. The door was open, and the people called the police. And Madison police arrived, and they had no idea who the student was. The student, again, was not able to communicate. They talked to the neighbors, and nobody knew who the student was. Well, they called our agency because we were pretty close, just in case. And our officers didn't know who they were, but they called me in the middle of the night. And I said, send me a picture. So they took a picture on their phone, sent it to me. Well, it was a student that I knew incredibly well. I had mom's phone number. I called dad. They had no idea that their child was gone. We connect everybody, and things go well. And that really got me keen on the idea of I shouldn't be the only one to hold the keys to this kingdom on knowing who our students are. Our staff needs to know who they are, and they need to know important information about that student. Emergency contact information. Is there any medical needs, medication needs that we need to be worried about? How do they communicate with the student in a stressful situation? If they've left the house, or if something negative is happening, maybe at the grocery store or in the car or at home, how do they interact with them? I know how I would, because I've built that relationship with them. But how do they do that, and how do they do it easily, and how do we get that information out to parents? I used the Google machine, and I'm trying to find different communities that may have a similar program, something that I had, in my brain. I didn't want to reinvent the wheel, and I couldn't find anything. I reached out to a number of autism associations throughout the state, nationally, and eventually I connected with a group, but I also connected with Mary Fruits, who is amazing. I talked to Mary about what some of my ideas were. She gave me a lot of guidance, helped me out with, just kind of planning and how to communicate with parents. I also, because I'm part of the McFarland School District community, I reached out to our guidance counselor staff, our principals, the superintendent, and talked to them about this idea that I had of trying to get student information with parents and then disseminating that to our officers. I gave the idea to my chief, and he was on board immediately. I communicated with our staff about it, and they thought it was a great idea because we're very community policing oriented department. I had everybody on board, the schools, the police department, that this is something that is important that we need to do. So we're using the school district. They've got information or addresses for all the parents. So we were able to send out this request that I had that if you're a parent and you have a child with special needs and that you think that it's important that the police know who your child is, we would like to know. And again, all the information that I asked or mentioned previously, and any other information that they could have to help us. So we had gotten a document together. We asked for a photograph of their child, emergency contact information, things to do or to not do or say to their child if the parents aren't present, to help facilitate this for our officers. Now, in the beginning, it was a little bit difficult to keep all this information together. And I would get a parent who would communicate with us. They would give us the document. And I started out having a binder in the office, and that wasn't very effective. I'd create a folder on their squad car computers. And every time we got somebody new, I'd have to go to each computer and squad car and update the information. And eventually we have a different program in our department that we use to communicate. And I was able to set up a folder on that. And now it's all digital. Wherever an officer is, they can access their squad computer and they can see who the student is and
So
the things that they need to know.
quick
Yes.
question, John. As we were talking, we did have a question come in. So was this totally voluntary for parents? Was there pressure to put their kids in the system? I know some parents are really leery about putting information about their kids out there.
Yeah.
So how did you deal with that sort of trust issue?
Yeah, it's absolutely 100% voluntary. We reached out to the community. We didn't reach out to individual parents. And we did a community listening session where we asked parents to come in, and I spoke there as well and explained the idea of it, the idea and the reason for it. So it's completely voluntary, no pressure at all. And what was the second part of your question? I'm sorry.
No, it was just that whole sense of building of trust, because I know there's some parents who don't want the names of their kids or any information about their kiddos out there. And so I'm assuming that
Sure.
part of this program, part of what you were doing is building that relationship and trust with those parents, and just wondering how that went.
Yeah, and it's was with a number of parents that I already knew that I had worked with. So I have that personal relationship with them that I've built, but it's expanding that out to the rest of our staff so that I'm not a super special police officer. I've learned so much stuff from the people that I work with, and I'm a reflection of the department that I work in. I don't work with bad people in our department, and they're all moms and dads, and they all want to do their best for the community. So it is building that relationship, and it can be difficult for some parents that maybe I hadn't had those interactions with before. But there's a method to the madness, so to speak, because we want to be able to deliver the best service that we can and the safest way we can for the person that we're interacting with and for ourselves. Because it can be, come to find out, sometimes in law enforcement, it can be a little dangerous out there. And it can also be, and we get that, but not every situation is super dangerous, right? And we don't want to treat every situation as being super dangerous. If that makes sense for you. So that was kind of one of the next points that I had was I named the program. It was a working title, Special Needs Awareness Program, so SNAP, and it kind of stuck. It wasn't the title that I was really looking for, but that's just was my working title, and it stayed. So we call it our SNAP program. So in order for we have our police department website, and we have information about our SNAP program on there. And a parent can go to that, download the document. I've got a cover letter on there that I wrote as well to go a little more in depth for that. I've had a number of parents call me and ask, like, hey, what does this mean? What can we do? And oftentimes that's really the jumping off point, is just having that conversation. They call me, if you'd like, I can just stop over at your house and visit with you and visit with your child and start building that relationship. Or it's a parent that has heard about it from somebody else, and they're very interested in the program. So one other interesting aspect of the SNAP program is we work on training our officers, but I also like to, when I interact with parents in this matter, I also like to try to train some of the parents. Oftentimes, when we get a call or somebody calls the police for help, we only get a very limited amount of information. And what I like to do is, when the parents call, there's some things that I think that are really important that they tell the dispatch. So if they call, if there's an emergency and they need help, and one of the first things that I want them to tell our dispatcher to tell us is that my child has special needs, and explain what the special need is and explain what the situation is. If it's one thing, if the special needs child is having an issue or a bad day and they call 911, that doesn't mean that we have to show up lights and sirens, because we've learned that doesn't always lead to a good initial contact. Lights and sirens, that's not a great way to do that. So when our staff hears that, my goal for them is to start slowing things down internally. And when they respond, I want them to be calm, relaxed, and be able to interact with the parent and the child. Now, obviously, there can be some exceptions to that. If it's an emergency and the child is in danger of harming themselves significantly, yeah, we want our officers to take action at that point. But it's our officers' response is going to be based on the information that we get from the parent that calls, or the sibling that calls, or the staff member at the school that calls for us. So that's something that's incredibly important for us. And
we did have on
sure.
the topic of communication, we did have a question. Is it helpful for adults with communication difficulties to carry an information card to give to law enforcement? Is part of what some law enforcement may be looking for is, if somebody's already stressed out and maybe they have some speech difficulties anyway, can they hand a card to an officer? Is that going to help the situation or not?
I think that is incredibly helpful for that officer to be able to get that information, because again, we get called to all kinds of situations, and there can sometimes be a standard response. And when somebody's not talking to us, well, is it because they're lying? Are they trying to hide something? What's the reason for this? Well, but if we can get a card or something that says, this is me, this is my name, and whatever pertinent or important information is, that's invaluable for that person to be able to give that officer. I think that's very, very important, and that could be very handy. And I see somebody else had a question. Oh, go ahead.
So then the follow-up to that is, how do you make sure the police don't mistake it as somebody like reaching for a weapon or being aggressive?
We like to ask people for identification. And that can be one of the first questions that we ask a person, is for identification. When we ask that question, we expect that somebody's going to reach into a wallet, into a purse. That part is okay. We don't want sudden movements. We want people to be calm as best as they can when they're doing that. So for instance, if the officer doesn't ask for identification, it's making that calm motion or reaching to a wallet. But we don't want fast or sudden moves doing that. And the officer may, if the officer sees that and we're not sure what's going on, we may ask, we may put our hand on their arm, right? But that's just as a control or protective measure to do that. But once we figure that out, what the purpose is, and we can read that card, we should slow things way down and work slowly through those things. If that makes sense. I don't have a better way to
Now that
do that, but that's the best that I can come up with.
no, I think that does make sense, and I love the point where you teach your fellow officers to just slow it down, because a lot of times things can get a little hectic, and just rapid fire questions, as you know, are not going to work for some of our friends. Is they need time to process and think through, or else it's going to get worse instead of better.
Yeah, and I think no matter what the situation is, if in law enforcement, if we are asking those rapid fire questions to anybody, it's going to be stressful. And one thing that I've noticed is that with the continued contact that our officers have with special needs students and adults, the better they act with them, but also with everybody else. And it's something that I've noticed quite a bit. So as far as our SNAP program goes, this is something that our officers have used quite a bit. Especially when we have a new student that's in the SNAP program, when I get that, it's put into our program where they can all access, but I also email them the contact sheet. I make sure everybody knows, hey, we have a new person in our program, please be aware, address, picture, emergency contact information, that they can start to become aware of that. So then when that name comes up and they know that it's a special needs student or adult, then they can go right to their file, pull that up, and they've got everything there that they need. And it's been successful for us. It's helped us out quite a bit.
How long has it been? How long has it been up and running now?
This program started. Let's see if I have that in my notes. I'm going to say it started about 5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. Maybe Mary might have a different, if she's able to. 4 or 5
If
years
she's not
ago.
now eating dinner.
Oh, she might be eating dinner.
Yeah, she's making dinner now. Hopefully, she's eating it. I don't know.
Yeah, I am eating.
Oh,
I think it was about 5 years ago. That sounds about right.
okay. Thanks, Mary.
Yep.
And is there a process where adults can be part of the program as well as or is it just for students?
Right. So this program was initially geared towards students, because that was most of the people that I would interact with, that the rest of our staff would. We've had a number of students that started in this program that are now adults, and we keep them in there. We keep them in the program. Part of the reason for that is because we have new officers that come into the department that may not know them. So when they pull that file up, when it's time to study the file or that program, it's there and they become familiar with it. So we do have adults in the program. Our police department has another program. It's called Are You Okay? And that one is traditionally geared towards adults and into the older adult range. But for this, it's predominantly students, but there's no reason we couldn't have adults in there. I got the request maybe a month ago, and the students were 20 years old. And yep, that's totally fine. They're in, and we got them. So that's good. We disseminated that information out. So there was that question. Thank you for asking. I see them pop up on my chat box.
John, can I interrupt for just 1 second?
Yes, ma'am.
One of the things that when we found out that we had a child with special needs. My husband is also deaf, and so he's considered special needs as well. One of the things I spoke to a previous officer before you, she had highly recommended contacting the local police department and letting them know that they could flag our address through the 911 system. And so I was able to go down. I let them know that we had an adult in the house who was deaf. We had a child in the house who had autism. And so that way, if 911 calls ever got brought to, if a call ever came that was flagged to our address, the officer or the first responder, whoever was coming to the address, would know that there was an adult who may not respond when spoken to. There was a child who may elope from the residence if the door is open for him. So that was something else that was highly recommended to us when we found out, when Clyde was first diagnosed, that we went ahead and pursued.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And we've done that with a number of people in our SNAP program through the village. And if a 911 call does get sent to that or come from that address, there's an alert that pops up on the officer's screen and gives them that information, which is another great tool for us. It's a great tool for our EMS and for our firefighters, and they get those same alerts that we do on our screen. One of the things that you had asked me about, were there any drawbacks to the program? And the initial drawback that I had was just how would we keep this information in a central area and that was easily accessible for our staff. And we were able to figure that out. It took a couple years, but we did get a program that could manage that for us. Another big drawback that I have not experienced, but one that I anticipate could happen, is if the number of people in our program becomes too large. And we've got 12 people in our program now, and that's at a real manageable number. Our staff is able to become familiar with those people in the program, but I don't know what an unmanageable number would be, but at some point, if our staff becomes unfamiliar with them, it's another problem I would try to have to tackle with that. And with that being said, I think it would be difficult for a community or large community to have this type of program, possibly. Say like a city of Madison. That would be pretty challenging, I think, for them to do so. They don't have, or I should say, they have so many officers in their department, and it's a very large community. I don't know what the special needs population in the city is, but it could be pretty significant. And I'm sure there's a way to do it, and it might be, as Mary said, flagging that through the 911 center, that or requesting that. So then if an officer does get called to your house, to make them aware that we have this population at the house.
A couple of things, John. Number one, I just want to let everybody know that I have been posting some links into the chat box, including links to the SNAP program, an article on flagging 911. So they're there if you want to copy, paste them, and look at them later. But I think you just brought up a really interesting point, because we know that not everybody's going to be able to move to McFarland, as awesome as a city as it is.
Yes.
So are there general, like if you didn't have the SNAP program, which luckily you do in McFarland, do you have suggestions for parents and for officers about how to maybe help the interaction go a little bit better?
Yeah, I think as parents, there's a couple avenues to go through. If you're in a school district where they have a school resource officer, they are a fantastic person to start with, because they may already know your student, and they may know them well. And it's getting to know that officer and communicating with them on what you want in an interaction with the police and with your school district. So I think that's a great step. Through your school resource officer, then you can start building those relationships with the rest of the staff. And that can include taking a tour through the police department, having a ride in the police car. I brought my police car to countless houses, visited countless kids, and come hang out in my police car. We do all these fun things to build that relationship. If you live somewhere where there is not a school resource officer, or maybe you have a community officer, it's reaching out to them as well and making that personal one-to-one connection. And I think it's important to do that before something bad happens. You get to meet that officer when things are calm. You can take your time, relax. Your child can meet them in a positive, low stress environment. And I think that's very important. And that way you put a face to the name, and it's not just a badge. And then for the officer, they can put a face to the name, and you're not just a citizen. You're not just a person they're coming because somebody called 911. That's a big interaction to have. And I think that's really important.
So we had another question come in for you. Do you find that new officers coming in over the years tend to be less informed or more informed, or informed about the same with de-escalation tactics in general? I mean, I know there's been a push for these de-escalation tactics. Is it having an effect on officers coming in?
Yeah, when I started in the academy 20 years, our de-escalation was a taser and a baton. I mean, that's what we had. And as we've gone through, the academy programs have changed drastically. The number of hours that an officer has to be in the police academy has gone up drastically. They've got specific programs just for de-escalation. So I think our new officers are coming in far better equipped at de-escalation than I was 20 years ago. So in my experience, they're coming in much better. And I will say that we know what our level of training was 20 years ago for de-escalation. And for our agencies, I'm in a 5-agency consortium. For probably the last 5 or 6 years, de-escalation has been a pretty heavy topic for us. So we know where that deficiency is for us, and it's something that we've really been working on. So our new officers coming in, I've learned from them and taken some of the things that I've seen them do, which I think is good. And they're coming in better prepared and equipped than I was 20 years ago, for sure.
Cool. And I had flagged a question that early on you had talked about that some of what you do is you talk to officers about what not to do in situations. What are some of those things that you're telling them to try to avoid doing in situations like this?
Yeah, I mentioned it before a little bit, but being calm, not using a loud, commanding voice. It is asking a question and giving some time for a response, and not asking question after question after question after question. It is not necessarily going hands-on with somebody right away. It's just, unless it's an emergency situation, we want them to just slow things way down, because we really have all the time that we need. When we're dealing with a student or a child with special needs, that's the most important thing that I'm doing. And that's the most important thing that they're doing. So we just take our time. It's also communicating. The thing that I want them to really do is communicate with the person that knows this child the best. You know, we have a parent, a sibling, a caretaker, what's going on, what can we do, type thing. And I've spent hours and hours and hours interacting with a special need child in the schools, because I have that much time to spend to make sure that the situation ends well. And our patrol officers have done the same, all the way up to my chief. I mean, he's been out on these calls with me and our other officers, and he's done the same thing. He's spent hours with us doing it. And when things end nicely, everybody's safe, like that's a good day. That's a win for us. So yeah, there's a lot of things for us to not do, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Um,
And part of the SNAP program, we have some of these generalities to not do, but there can also be some specifics for that individual child, that keywords to not say. Don't mention this because things are just going to go poorly. And those are some of the things that the information that we like to collect for our program. So then when the officers get there, like, oh, we're not going to talk about this thing, this topic, whatever it is. We're not going to say these words because we want things to go nicely.
have you been approached by any other small towns or villages, maybe Stoughton, about how to implement a similar program to SNAP? Is there any interest in other communities in doing this?
I believe Cottage Grove had reached out to me a few years ago, but beyond that, no. No. But I will say that I am more than happy if you communicate with Stoughton and they are interested in this. I've got time to spend to help them with this, or any other community that you're in, or if somebody has wants some help communicating with a police officer or their police department, call me. I've been around for a long time. I know a lot of these people, and it's just a phone call away. I mean, it's a great thing.
Well, that's awfully generous of you, because I know that we have parents that are just like, oh, I don't know who to ask this question to, and I am not, immersed in law enforcement, and so I can talk in generalities and what I've learned from different conferences. But
Mhm.
to be able to have someone that you can call and say, well, this is what happened. I know you can't sit there and say, oh, that was bad, that was good, but how can we make it better?
Yep.
How can we make this interaction better next time?
Yep. And you have my work phone number and my email. Those are all public. So
Yep.
when this is done, you can attach that to anything you like. And if somebody has a question or a comment or something I can do better or I can help them with, everybody is free to reach out to me, to give me a call or send me an email.
Excellent. Taking down notes, as you can tell.
That's all right.
Anybody want to chime in with a question?
Tim, I have a question. Is is there a specific list of like communication tips or something you hand out to officers or anything like that?
Um, I mean, the primary ones are the ones that I mentioned on our initial response. I don't have a kind of a cheat sheet to do that. Some of it's just in my brain and based on my experiences, some of the trainings that I've had.
Quite a while ago, because my son is now 42, I created such a cheat sheet.
Oh,
Would you be interested in seeing that?
I love cheat sheets.
Okay.
Yeah.
I could send that to you and anybody else here who would like to have a copy. If
Yeah.
Tim would, Tim, you might want to include, even though John says it's easy to find him, if you had his email address, I could.
I will send out the email address and John's phone number to everybody who is part of this, because I have all your email addresses. So tomorrow I will compile the different links that I've placed into the chat box, as well as then I'll add John's information, so that you all have that. And so then you can communicate to John, and then who knows, maybe we can come up with something more than just, maybe we can come up with Nancy and John believe this, because your experience, Nancy, is invaluable. I mean, you've been a mom for a while, and John's been an officer for a while. So I'd love to see if we can get some common ideas going there. I think that'd be great.
Yeah.
I also wanted to mention that the cheat sheet that I have has been vetted by a couple of our autistic adults to make sure that it is as useful as possible.
I like that.
Yeah, that's so important. Mary, just want to note that Mary did put a comment in the chat box. You got to find your champion in your community. So those of you that are not lucky enough to live in McFarland, trying to talk to other parents, community organizations, who might be that officer that might be the most interested in spearheading this. Because I think Mary's right, it's so much more helpful to find that champion, someone who's inside that wants to give it a little bit of energy, to talk to the chief about. And unless you happen to know the chief, then just go to the chief. Um, but yeah, finding that champion is important. So feel free to ask other organizations. If you have neighborhood police officers, ask them who the best might be. I know Madison is big on neighborhood policing. I think there was that note in the chat box that Madison uses a neighborhood type police stuff. So and that's the thing, is each community can be so different in how they're set up and how they want to be communicated with. So one of the things is figuring out how does your city, village, county work? Who is it that you need to talk to? Do you interact, speaking of which, do you interact at all with Dane County then?
I do. I do. We've got a school resource officer group for all of our SROs in Dane County, and on a non-COVID year, we get together every month and communicate what we have going on. But as far as community officers and deputies, we've got community deputies and through the Dane County Sheriff's Office as well, or beat deputy. They know their community or their area better than a road deputy, for sure, typically. And I will say that there's 15 me's in our police department. I know that you're going to find it, depending on what community you live in. If you reach out to that department, you will find somebody that wants to do a better job for their community, because it's an important community. This is one of the most important things that I do in my job. It's one of the most important things that I do.
That is great. Any final questions, comments for Officer Miller, or as he's known to John by his friends, which I now include myself as? Thank you very much.
Yes.
Any final thoughts?
I could pipe in.
Great, Chris.
Jocko Willenick, who is an ex-Navy SEAL, was on the Joe Rogan podcast recently, and he said that police departments are, quote, set up to do the most ridiculously minuscule amount of training possible. Do you believe that's at all true, or is that false based on what you've seen?
Training is always interesting because it's only as effective as, well, it's going to be as effective as the person training you and as effective as the student who wants to learn. Where I promise that every police officer that I know has gone into this job to help their community, to be a person to help, and to be a person that people can come to when they need help. So training aside, all of our officers want to do the best job that they can. And we can always be better trained, no matter what job that we're in. In law enforcement, we can do better, and we're certainly trying. I agree with that.
Yeah, Cheryl.
I have a couple things. Have you worked with Janesville at all?
I have not.
Okay. And also, one thing I told my child, and I had a friend that worked in the juvenile system, said, if an officer says stand down, lay down the ground, spread eagle. I mean, I've just said that to him because, if you're not following directions, then situations can escalate too. So I don't know if you think that's a good thing to pass on to people or not. I mean, even if you haven't done anything wrong, if you're in a group of people and things are going bad and the officer says,
Mm.
stand down, you better lay on the ground, spread eagle and be still.
I mean, for me personally, that would be pretty surprising if if I said to stand down or stop and somebody did that. I'd be pretty surprised if that happened. It's probably an effective way to present that you're non-threatening.
Mm. Yeah.
But it may set it may set a bad precedent for future law enforcement interactions for that person.
And what would you suggest that my son's 32, and
Okay.
what would you suggest he do if the officer says stand down?
Stop what they're doing.
Okay.
Yeah, and just relax and wait for other instructions. And hopefully that officer is going to be at the point where they're going to be calm, relaxed.
I think at that point, if the officer is barking stand down, they're probably not
Oh,
relaxed.
if they're at that point, yeah. If they're barking that, or if they're being loud and direct, yeah, it may take a little while for that situation to calm down. I agree.
Any other questions, comments, discussion points?
I just wanted to add, since my son is also an adult, but what Cheryl said, stand down generates visual pictures that don't match what the
Right.
words say.
Well, yeah.
And that's why I said that to Scott, because he wouldn't understand what that means.
Because
do I stand, or do you
Yeah.
want me to get down?
Right.
I don't know how to do both.
and so that's why it's really important for law enforcement to not use idioms, but to use completely descriptive words about what they want to happen.
Absolutely.
Usually in a positive way rather than a negative way. Like if you want somebody to do something, tell them what you want them to do, not what you don't want them to do.
Correct.
Thank you for clarifying that, Nancy. I mean, that was one of the reasons I said that to Scott with my friend who said in juvenile, she worked in the juvenile system, but also understanding he wouldn't know what that phrase means, possibly. He wouldn't be able to decipher what to do.
Yeah, and I can certainly see that being an ambiguous statement. That's not one that's not something that I say, and it's not at least the way we train. That's not a term that we would tell somebody to do, at least here in McFarland.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So that I could see that being very confusing. So it sounds like looks like we're gonna close out, Tim, and I'll just say that I am absolutely available for anybody that has questions, is looking to open up some communication with their police department. Anything that you need, if this is a program that you think might be beneficial for your community, please reach out, and I'm more than happy to work with your local agency or a school resource officer or community officer, police officer, chief or sheriff. I'm more than happy to help out and be a part of that for whatever you need.
Well, thank you so much for
Thank you.
taking time to be here.
Very informative.
Yep, we appreciate it, and we appreciate everybody being on as well. Hope everybody has a good night and a safe night. Talk to y'all later. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, John.
You bet. Good night, Mary.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody.